Welcome very much. I'm very glad to see you all at this Nuffield Foundation seminar. It's the first in a series, and our main subject today is the lives of families with young children and how they're changing. Because today marks the publication of the first of our chapters of our first review from our Changing Face of Early Childhood series, which is led by Carey Oppenheim, who's going to be presenting today. My name is Tim Gardam. I'm the Chief Executive of the Nuffield Foundation, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. But there's a great deal of material to consider and a number of speakers with long experience and wide expertise. So my job really is just to ensure that we get the most out of the wealth of insights in the time available. Now, the purpose of the Nuffield Foundation is to fund research of direct relevance to questions of policy and practice. Research that addresses disadvantage, vulnerability, and constraints on opportunity. All in all, the key questions that surround how we can better foster social well-being in our society. And the Nuffield Research Portfolio comprises grants to researchers from inside and outside the academy. But the challenge, however, has always been to shape all these different outputs so that the many insights and findings can get noticed by those who work in the pressured worlds of policy and of practice. So the Changing Face of Early Childhood in the UK is going to be one of our landmark projects and will dominate our agenda over the next year. And given the repercussions for families over the past 9 months of the pandemic, it could not be more timely. But this is by no means simply a COVID project. It has much longer time horizons and a far greater breadth of concerns. It draws on research funded by the Foundation and other key studies, and the review addresses the most pressing questions about the changing nature of family life and what that means for the experience of young children in the UK today. And we're very pleased to see that many attending this seminar are those on whose research we are drawing, and they're here with us this afternoon. I think you've all had a copy of the review this morning sent you by email. We've also published an introduction to the series as a whole, including details of the research projects that underpin it, which we shared with you with the invitation to this afternoon's webinar. And links to both will be posted in the chat, and Carey, of course, will be expanding on the themes and objectives of the series as a whole in her presentation. Now, this project is essentially a synopsis. It's constructed over 7 chapters, and they'll be published over the next 9 months. It's derived from over 80 research grants, totaling some 15 million and more of Nuffield-funded research, and those grants have been awarded over the past 7 years. And all are rooted in the Foundation's 3 domains of its research interests in education, justice, and welfare. So the aim of this project is to surface the wealth of evidence and many separate insights so that a more conjoined picture emerges for those interested audiences. And it's designed to focus thinking and frame the hard choices around policy and practice at a time when some of the emerging questions about poverty, vulnerability, and opportunity have really never felt more urgent. The Foundation has been extremely fortunate to have persuaded Carey Oppenheim to work with us. As you all know, Carey was advisor on child policy and child poverty in Downing Street in the Blair government, and she went on to set up the Early Intervention Foundation, along with many other projects and other roles. And her book, Parents, Poverty and the State, with Naomi Eisenstadt, was published last year. Now, Carey's been working closely with Jordan Rehill from the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, who will be co-presenting today, and with Nathan Archer. And today we're going to concentrate on the first of our 7 chapters of this synoptic report, with the necessary starting point, the question, how are the lives of young people changing? Following their presentation, we'll hear from our 3 respondents, Baroness Philippa Stroud, Professor Anne Phoenix, and Professor Leon Feinstein, before inviting contributions from other guests with expertise in some of the areas we're going to explore. And we'll then take questions from the audience, so please do put your questions in the Q&A at any point during the webinar, and do please highlight if your question is for any particular speaker. So our aim here is for the discussion to become a seminal part of the final report, as we try to incorporate your thinking and your insights into the conclusions and the consequent challenges that we will present next autumn. And these will arise from the picture that we now are going to paint in this project of what it means to live your first 5 years of life in Britain today. Finally, a couple of practical points. You're not going to be visible or audible during this webinar. We've live closed captioning in English today, To turn it on, please click the CC button along the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll make a recording of the webinar that will be available on our website shortly after it's over. So with that, I'm now going to hand to Carey and Jordan, who will present the findings of this first chapter of the review. Carey.
Thank you. I'll just get my presentation up. So I hope you can see that now. Okay. Whoop, let me just. So, the review that we've published today puts a spotlight on the changing nature of family life and its implications for the economic security, development and wider well-being of young children. And as Tim has said, this has added significance in the context of COVID-19, when issues of social well-being and inequalities have really been thrown into sharp relief. This period of shock and flux, I think, enables us to return to some fundamental questions. What do young children need to flourish? How best to protect vulnerable groups? Inequalities in home learning? And how can family policy underpin a resilient society? This is just to give you very briefly some context on the overall series, The Changing Face of Early Childhood. You can see the future reports at the bottom of the slide, and the goals of the project explained in the slides. You'll see that the next report that's coming out is on poverty and vulnerability, and today our focus is largely on families as a whole. But we very much hope that this work will both open up a conversation as well as be useful to inform policy and practice. So we've begun our series by looking at the family context in which young children are growing up and how that's changed over the last 2 decades. This is both because family life and circumstances have a particularly important role in relation to early childhood, but also because this really runs through all the topics that we consider over the course of this work. And the data shows that family life has changed markedly, both in terms of the changing nature and form of families and sometimes greater complexity, and in terms of how families are organising their working patterns and care of their children. And these changes in family circumstances and experiences are not felt equally. There are inequalities by income, by education, ethnicity and place. And we also see that there's been an increasing role for public policy in family and children's lives across different political administrations. And this is a theme that Naomi Eisenstadt and I explored in the book we wrote last year, and something we might return to in the conversation. So this will be familiar data to you, I'm sure. On average, mothers are having their children when they're older, and they're also having smaller families. The figure shows the increasing number of babies born to older mothers over the last 20 years. Interestingly, if you have a look at the yellow and green lines at the bottom of the graph, we can see that in 2015, the fertility rate for women over 40 exceeded that of women under 20 for the first time, a trend that has been sustained over the last 3 years. And some of this change is also linked to the sharp reduction in the number of teenage mothers. Patterns in family fertility and the size of family are also associated with a level of maternal education and deprivation. So why does this matter? Well, there's a relationship between the age at which you have your child and family size and early childhood outcomes. And I think it highlights the polarization in the choices that parents make or have in relation to when they have children. And then I think there's some really interesting and important questions about the growth of one-child families and the role of siblings and what this means for children's cognitive and emotional development. So changing family context, the story here is both one of continuity and change, and that the data won't surprise you. You see the decline of marriage, an increase in cohabitation, and a stabilisation of lone parenthood. In fact, around 60% of children are still living in married couple families. But the decline in marriage has been slower in some parts of the country. So in Northern Ireland, slower than in the rest of the UK, and amongst British, Asian and Chinese families. It's important to bear in mind that families are dynamic. You know, a significant proportion of children will experience different family structures over their lives. Susan Harkness, who's going to join us later, has highlighted that multiple changes in family structure are damaging for children's early outcomes, but the data shows these still account for only a small proportion of all families with children under 5. But I guess the most striking thing about this is the key data that's missing, which is data on what's happening in relation to separation, repartnering, blended families and fathers overall. And this absence of data is being explored in the work that Caroline Bryson and colleagues have done. And I think what it really shows is that some of our principal sources of data no longer reflect the reality of modern family life in the UK. And as a result, policies, resources and services may not be meeting the needs of children growing up in different kinds of families. So changing family context, as we look at family structure and separation here and the impact on child outcomes. The research in this area is complex and nuanced. We draw on work by IFS, by Susan Harkness, Elsa Fitzsimmons and colleagues. There are differences in children's early outcomes when you compare married and cohabiting parent families. But when socioeconomic status and educational background of those who marry and those who cohabit are taken into account, the differences in young children's outcomes, especially cognitive outcomes, largely disappears. Cohabiting parents are also more likely to separate than those who are married, and children who have experienced separation also have poorer outcomes on average. But the evidence suggests that this is mainly explained by the different characteristics of people who choose to cohabit or marry. Recent research says that the differences in the early cognitive development of young children in lone mother and two-parent families appear to be largely accounted for by differences in socioeconomic circumstances rather than family structure or parenting practices. Finally, the work that Gordon Harold and the Early Intervention Foundation has done is this kind of growing body of work on the relationship between parents and how they communicate and parental conflict. And we know that unresolved hostile conflict between parents, regardless of family structure, has been shown to be damaging for early childhood well-being and outcomes, and indeed for later outcomes. So what do we take away from this complex picture? So I think we need more research to disentangle these factors, particularly in relation to social and emotional development and the impact it has depending on the age of the child. And when we think about policy and practice responses, we need to take account of the interplay between family forms and socioeconomic circumstances. So I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Jordan, who's going to look at the relationship between work and care. So over to you, Jordan.
Can you see my slides, Dan? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks a lot, Carey. So I'm going to briefly walk through the broad trends in employment and care. And I'm going to do so by looking at the employment rate of mothers of young children over time, the policy interventions that have contributed to this, and I'll also talk through some of the implications and questions as a result of these changes. So as the figure shows on the slide, we've seen a deliberate shift in the role of public policy in family life, in contrast to earlier decades. We've also seen the clear impact changes to welfare policy and increased free early education provision with a great number of funded hours being offered by successive governments. And it's this rise in sort of state-financed and provided education and care, which is arguably one of the biggest changes in young children's lives. However, there are clear patterns in the take-up of this provision according to area, family, and child characteristics. Meanwhile, we've also seen a squeeze on household incomes due to welfare reform and wage stagnation, which has impacted on how parents engage with the labour market. And this means that most children under 5 will now grow up in a household where both parents or a lone parent are now working. And data also suggests that mothers of very young children are returning to employment sooner after giving birth. However, there are, however, variations within this general trend, and we know that mothers from particular ethnic groups have much lower employment rates on average. And this has also impacted on care arrangements within the home. And while we've seen small increases to the time that fathers spend on childcare, mothers still carry out much more childcare than men. And I'll discuss how the pandemic has impacted on these trends in the next few slides. So what can we take from this, really? So as I mentioned at the top of the slide, successive governments have intervened more readily into families' lives, resulting in more mothers of young children being in work and more children being in formal early years provision. And these changes have influenced the times and spaces in which parents interact with their children. And this raises some important questions. What impact have these changes had on parental choice, and specifically the choices available to mothers? Are parents happy or satisfied with the balance of parenting and paid employment? Also, what do these changes mean for the relationships and attachment between parents and children? And what policy might provide more integrated experiences of work and care? So we've also seen a shift in attitudes towards mothers' employment in recent years. So as the figure on the right shows, some attitudes are still entrenched regarding mothers returning to full-time work, though there has been a softening of views in recent years. So this data comes from British Social Attitudes, and it shows that a dwindling portion of people now feel that mothers should remain at home when a child is under school age. So in 1989, when this question was first posed to a section of the population, some 64% of those surveyed agreed that a mother should stay at home with preschool children. By 2017, this has dropped to around a third. And the set of bars on the left are also quite interesting because they show that support remains rare for the idea that a mother with a child below school age should work full time, though it's more than doubled from 2% in 1989 to 7% in 2017. So what we've really seen is a relaxing of views, but others remaining ingrained. We've got this interesting schism here where you have a growing proportion of mothers in work and in full-time work, yet a majority feeling that women should not work full-time when a child is under school age. So turning to the impact of COVID-19. So in the review, we identify 4 key ways in which the pandemic and the economic aftermath are affecting families with young children. First, and as we all know, COVID-19 has cost millions of adults their permanent employment. We also know that prior to the pandemic, over a third of families where the youngest child was under 5 were in poverty. And though the government has introduced substantial measures to protect the incomes of many of those in low-income households and those affected by the lockdown, some have missed out. And we also know that COVID-19 is affecting Black, Asian, and ethnic minority families, as well as younger generations and women in various ways. It's both intensifying existing inequalities and compounding pressures. Second, we know that the combination of job losses and a shift to home working is changing how parents spend their time and divide responsibilities for paid work, childcare, and housework. So we have emerging research from the Resolution Foundation and the IFS that has showed the differential impact of lockdown measures on employment, suggesting that it's mothers who have been particularly badly affected. We also know that mothers are still doing the bulk of childcare, though fathers have increased the time they're spending on this. So according to recent estimates, they're doing nearly twice as many hours as they were in 2014-15. And these changes to caring arrangements are likely to have significant influence on children's development and outcomes. Third, a large proportion of children under 5 will have missed around 6 months of reception class or being in an early years setting. And data from Ofsted is showing that while a large number of children have returned to formal provision, a large proportion of parents are actually choosing not to send their children back into early years settings. And we do not yet know what the long-term impact of this lost time will be on how children play, learn, and interact with others. But concerns have been raised by practitioners in surveys with Ofsted again about how the pandemic and missing a chunk of early years provision has impacted on children's personal, social, and emotional development. And fourth, there's growing concern about the sustainability of private and of the sector as a whole, the private and voluntary childcare sector. So we know the sector was vulnerable before the pandemic, We also know that many settings are now in danger of long-term closure as a result of reduced demand. And we will explore these in greater depth in our third review. But the important point to take away here is the pre-existing challenge of both sustaining childcare provision and improving its quality is particularly acute in the current context because it has implications for both children's development and parents' ability to return to work. So what do we make of all of this? So as Carey said at the top of the presentation, today's generation of under fives are the first in which a majority is spending a large part of their childhoods in formal education and care and have parents who are both in paid employment. And compared to previous generations, young children are more likely to have older parents, fewer siblings, and a greater chance of experiencing a variety of family relationships. Naturally, these findings spawn numerous questions, and we outline a number of these in the review. On the slide, you'll see some of the key questions that arise from what we've discussed. And I'll hand back to Tim now, who will talk through some of these questions in more detail with our panelists.
Right. Thank you very much, Carey, and thank you, Jordan. What obviously we saw there was very much a thumbnail sketch of the wealth of data which is in the main report, which I encourage you to dig into. We have those 4 questions laid out to structure our discussion. Does family structure matter for young people's well-being and their outcomes? And that relationship of the implications of the changing patterns of work and care for parents and young children's well-being and their life chances. The key question of inequality, is it still the most significant factor in determining early childhood experience? And then that 4th question about family policy itself, is it still something which is a key priority for government? To which I suppose there are 2 other reflections that emerged from that presentation. One, how COVID, as everywhere, is an intensifier in many ways of underlying issues which were there before it. And then I thought the point that Carey made right at the start about the significance of what we don't know and the shortcomings in the data and whether the principal sources of data don't reflect the nature of family life and what we need to find out. So there's a lot there to discuss, and I'm going to go to 3 of our respondents first and ask them each to reflect as they will on those questions. I'm going to start with Philippa Stroud, Baroness Philippa Stroud, who's the Chief Executive of the Legatum Institute. As many of you know, she was previously the Chief Executive of the Centre for Social Justice, and she was at one stage Special Advisor to Ian Duncan Smith when he was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and also to the Prime Minister from 2012. And it was in those roles that she was responsible for the development of the social justice agenda, working on some of the government's key welfare reform programme, indeed universal credit, the creation of social investment, and new child poverty measures. And so I'm going to go to Philippa first before then turning to Professor Anne Phoenix and Professor Leon Feinstein. So Philippa, your reflections on what we've just heard.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction, and just congratulations too on a great report. I think getting anything out in these COVID days is nothing short of a miracle, but getting out such a thoughtful and coherent document is to be congratulated. I have deep respect for Carey Oppenheim and have loved working with her on to learn from Jordan Rahill, so congratulations. As you say, you've outlined 3 questions for us to look at this afternoon in response to the document. So let me take the first of these. Does family structure matter for young children's well-being and outcomes? I mean, obviously that's a huge question for the last 20 centuries would have been an absolute no-brainer. But in your paper, you argue that once education, occupation, income and housing tenure are controlled for, and once unplanned pregnancy and relationship quality are controlled for, that there's no difference in outcomes of emotional and social skills between families that are married and those that are cohabiting or lone parents. However, the research also suggests that improving socioeconomic status and stability of relationship are more fruitful than marriage as avenues to improve children's outcomes. I think that what is often not understood by those who cannot see the merit in marriage is that those of us who are committed to it as a public policy tool are not committed on the basis of any ideology, but rather because it is the most amazing tool for achieving those twin objectives: stability of relationship and improvement in social economic status. We know from research conducted by the IFS that couples that are cohabiting at the time of their child's birth, rather than being married, are less likely to live together when their child is age 3. So obviously we're looking for something that improves stability. And we know that one of the ways of lifting families out of poverty is to have 2 full-time incomes coming into that family. And the best way of achieving this is to have a stable relationship of 2 full-time earners. This obviously does not undermine the extraordinary work undertaken by lone parents, but we do need to look at the statistics here that 46% of children in lone parent households are in poverty. So given that 81% of people think it's important for children to grow up living with both parents, a potential avenue of further research would be, if we agree that stability matters, how do we as a society develop the skills that will enable us to develop and maintain stable relationships? This is, to me, one of the most serious challenges for us as a society. And I think whilst the report is full of great information, is perhaps one area that could be developed. So the second question, though, is what are the implications of the changing patterns of work and care for parents and for young children's well-being, experiences and life chances? The report rightly draws attention to the fact that more of this generation have experienced both their parents working and have been placed in formal childcare at an early age, the effect of which is still relatively unknown. The understandable changing nature of family work practices and the consequent use of childcare raises important questions. For me, there are some interesting questions raised by the report, but there are some even more interesting questions that the report does not raise, such as where non-family members are providing care for infants, do they have the same ability to develop self-regulation and self-soothing in a child? And when 2 parents are working, do they have the capacity to hear their children, focus on their development and supervise aspects of their lives, such as social media use? We are undertaking one of the biggest social experiments with very little evidence for the impact that this sort of separation from a parent could be having on the brain development of a child. And this is an urgent area of research. And finally, is inequality the most significant factor in determining early childhood experience? I'm going to interpret this to mean poverty, as obviously every family, regardless of structure, is of equal worth. I do not have the experience for what I'm about to say, but I think that stability and security are probably the most significant factors determining early childhood experience. And obviously, if we take Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a guide to this, then it is quite obvious that adequate income is crucial. But it is also obvious that an environment of safety and nurture and love are also critical. One thing I would like to add, though, and probably finish with, is we are currently witnessing an unprecedented rise in mental health problems in children and young people. Despite being more connected than any previous generation through social media, more children are expressing feelings of loneliness and depression than ever before. While the causes of these trends are not clear, this is a crucial issue, as poor mental health and adverse events during childhood are known to have lifelong effects. For example, poor mental health in childhood can lead to poor performance at school, affecting academic outcomes. And if I were Nuffield, I would want to know whether the social revolution that has taken place under our noses has anything to do with this explosion of adolescent mental health. 1 in 10 British 11 to 15-year-olds are experiencing mental health problems, and 1/3 of 15-year-olds and 1/10 of 15-year-old girls and 1/10 of 15-year-old boys report self-harming. This has to be coming from somewhere. The prevalence of distress among teenage girls is very marked, and in a government study involving a survey of 30,000 14 to 15-year-olds, 37% of girls had 3 or more symptoms of psychological distress. For example, feeling worthless or unable to concentrate. Suicide among girls and women aged 10 to 29 increased by 19% during 2015 to 2015. And it's convenient for us as adults to blame it on social media, but a study released by the Office of National Statistics in April 2018 shows that our current generation of children is one that feels the most alone. This is truly tragic because many of them are still growing up in family households. What is driving this? If I were Nuffield, I would want to explore the connection between this level of mental distress in our young people and the silent revolution in the family that has been taking place.
So I've just unmute myself. Philippa, thank you. You disappeared. You now come back, but we heard you very clearly.
Sorry, I didn't see my camera go off while I was speaking.
We were able to concentrate on what you said very well. And thank you for setting up the responses, particularly that point about stability and security and challenges for Nuffield's own future research agenda, and bringing full square the issue of mental health and stress. We'll come back to those, I'm sure, and indeed already some questions in the Q&A, which we'll pick up from some of what you mentioned. But first I'm going to go straight on to our next respondent, who is a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, Professor Anne Phoenix. Anne, as you will know, is Professor of Psychosocial Studies at the Institute of Education at UCL, and is also the Kerstin Hesselgren Guest Professor at Umeå University in Sweden. She's known for her work on social identities and psychosocial processes, on parenting and youth, and is a fellow of the British Academy and the Academy of Social Sciences. So, with your perspective and your experience, can I turn to you to take forward the response?
Thank you very much, Tim. And I would like to start also, as Philippa did, by congratulating Carey and Jordan for what is a wonderful report. It's a model of clarity, and it's brought such lucidity to bringing together a synthesis of 80-odd studies. Amazing. So to start with the very first question, does family structure matter for young children's well-being and outcomes? Well, one of the things that I very much liked about the report is that it made clear that family structures and relations are dynamic, as indeed the whole of the report does, and that they've become more complex and diverse over time. And I take away, perhaps unlike Philippa, the notion that it's not a particular family form that's beneficial or detrimental in straightforward ways, but who is more likely to be part of the family forms and why, what their histories are, what the resources are that they have to draw on. I also want to say that household structures do not neatly map onto family forms. And I was struck in the 1990s, for example, by the work of Tracy Reynolds on African Caribbean mothers, who showed that being an African Caribbean lone mother in a household by yourself with a child didn't necessarily mean that fathers were not around, that the mother's siblings and parents were not really active in childcare, being highly involved, and that had an impact on the children's well-being and how they did. It's also the case, as we know, that some households contain many generations, and that therefore the family is much more extended, able to offer more people to children who care for them. The point that I want to make is that we need to see family structures and household formations as part of wider webs of social relations and support networks. And we need to think about the quality of those relations and networks. COVID-19 has made it clear that some children are experiencing more violence and abuse from being shut up with a mother and a father in lockdown, in a married relationship. We need to think about the quality of those relationships and the things that bear on them and the processes that lead to particular outcomes. And I think the adage that it takes a village to raise a child is completely relevant. There is nobody who can raise a child on their own, but equally, no two people are enough, and it depends on what the state is doing and the other people around. There are many other family forms as well that we need to know more about, and that I look forward to Nuffield doing some work on. It is the case that there are still a small group of mothers, but increasing, who are single by choice. In all sorts of ways, people are beginning to do research on this. We need to know more about it. And I liked the fact that the report talks about children who have no siblings, who are only children. And there's been work done on them in psychology for many decades, but it seems to me that we need some more thinking about what that means for the web of social relations. So the second question, the implications of changing patterns of work and care for parents and for young children's well-being, experiences and life chances. And the changes that the report is talking about occur in a context where we've long known about differences in patterns of employment by socioeconomic status, ethnicity, pattern of household organization, and so on. And we need to learn more about the meaning of these patterns for parents and children. We need to learn more about the processes by which they make a difference to well-being and outcomes for children, and various puzzles remain. So in the report, for example, why is it that children for whom English is not their first language are less likely to take up their government-funded childcare entitlements? Is that related to findings that parents who work irregular hours are less likely to use formal childcare? What are the implications for children in those families over time? What about the fact that African Caribbean mothers, who were always, since we've had the figures, more likely than other mothers to be employed, have also increased their childcare? At least they had. We don't know if they will prove to be some of those who are most likely to have been made unemployed by the current pandemic. The report highlights the fact that formal and informal care are blended for some children and families, with, for example, grandparents being part of a package. Of course, that's not possible where grandparents are themselves employed, as an increasing number are, or where they live too far away or are not in good relationships with families and with their children. So this raises issues of differences between children and families. And it's absolutely clear from the report that children's well-being and their parents is dependent on the quality of the childcare that's available and that families, parents can afford. So it's not just that patterns of employment have shifted, but what parents are expected to do to care for their children and also to be employed to provide sufficient money for those children. As Ellie Lee, Charlotte Fairclough and others have made clear, parenting cultures now include what Esther Dermott calls much more intensive parenting. That's likely to deepen inequalities, what people can offer. And Philippa said earlier that two-parent households are more likely to be able to provide for children because they can have two people who are able to go out to work. But because of the difficulties that many face with affording childcare of high quality, I think that we need to ask more questions and to think about the ways in which the pandemic has illuminated those shifts in patterns of work and care for children, so that children in technology-rich households might, for example, be able to do better than some others because they also have access to richer resources than some of those who don't, when, for example, parents are at home and busy with work issues. The question on inequality and early childhood experience. The point I'd want to make here is that inequalities run through the whole of childhood experiences and family lives. So of course, Philippa's absolutely right that emotional warmth, love and care are central to children's experiences. But the ways in which children and their families are positioned affect even how warmth and love can be expressed. As the Marcus Rashford holiday school lunches debate has underlined, there are some children who live in such poverty that they do not have enough to eat. They lose weight during the school holidays. And the loss of jobs or even the furloughing with COVID-19 has led some parents who were previously well able to manage economically to rely on food banks. And this highlights the dynamism in families and children's lives that the report demonstrates. But it's also, as the report says, that it's not just about economic privation, but that the stresses and strains that poverty produces can make it difficult for their parents to show love and care by even things we would want to take for granted, like providing nourishing food, physical warmth, and comfortable housing with good internet connections. It stops them from providing for children's well-becoming as well as their well-being. So undoubtedly, the implications of socioeconomic inequality have a marked impact on children's experiences and life chances. The report both shows the range of research we have on this and gets us to think about how the economic emergency that COVID-19 has produced will exacerbate already existing inequality. But of course, it's important to think of inequalities in the plural and recognize that different inequalities are produced from different processes. So socioeconomic inequalities is not the only source. The resurgence of Black Lives Matter has produced numerous accounts from young people and from adults who are from Black groups as well as other minoritized ethnic groups that explore the experiences, the impact and meaning of the racialized, ethnicized, religious inequalities and discrimination they experienced in childhood. I would argue that these inequalities haunt society and childhood experiences and well-being, and that we need to know more about the processes by which they do this. I would also point out that there are gender inequalities and they remain strong among parents. Carey made that clear in her talk just now. And there are also inequalities in the warmth and affection available to children. And we know from other research that society is still doing far too little to disrupt the inequalities faced by children who are looked after in state care, who suffer the worst decrements, I think, in their well-being and well-becoming. And of course, they're also racialized, gendered, and so on. So it's important to think about inequalities in the plural and to think about the ways in which redressing inequalities require thinking about what the state can do. So therefore, in answer to the fourth question, and I know that my time has largely run out, I would say that we need to think about poverty, childcare, employment, and equalities to do with racialization, ethnicization, and so on, and all those policies which perhaps are not always focused on children and childhood need to be brought together if really we're going to start from the wealth of research the report presents, do more research that allows us to think about meanings, processes, children's perspectives, and really actually getting to a point where there's social justice and inequality for children and families.
And thank you very much indeed, also for throwing some further challenges out for our research agenda and drawing attention to the complexities of the ethnic and gendered issues that you identify. I think we'll all hold on to that sense of the conditions in which warmth and love can be expressed and the inequalities of warmth and affection available to children is something which we should put centre stage in our research agenda. I must apologise for the fact that there's a lot of noise from where I'm chairing because I've decided to dig up the road in the past 10 minutes. So I'm going to, without ado, turn now to Professor Leon Feinstein, who is our third respondent, Professor of Education and Children's Social Care at the Reith Centre at Oxford University. Leon, of course, was the Director of Evidence at the Children Commissioner's Office and was Professor of Education and Social Policy at the Institute of Education before that. He's also worked in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. And Leon, can I turn now to you for your response?
Thank you very much, Tim, and delighted, if slightly challenged, to follow wonderful presentations from Anne and Philippa, both tremendously rich. And I also want to welcome this report. I think it's very timely, and it's wonderful to see the synthesis going on. It was one of the things that used to frustrate me as a civil servant, that universities are very good at synthesizing at university level. So you get Sussex says this, and Essex says this, and Oxford says this, and so on. And then the challenge of synthesis is left to you as a civil servant, and no one better than Carey in doing that work. So I think it's a wonderful resource, and also very timely. You know, we are in very challenging times, and thinking about children and childhood and families at this time. We have to mention 10 years of austerity, and now COVID, and likely further austerity. And as a result of which, the policy environment is extremely challenging. And so I think it's very timely to think about what are the big trends, and where can policy and society respond to those trends. And asking these questions, I think, is very important. In my short commentary, I think what I'd like to do in trying to answer the questions is reflect on some of the challenge of policy and how that relates to the challenges of social science. It seems to me some of our weaknesses in understanding how to answer these questions, some of the weaknesses of data and evidence, which are, I think, still very apparent as we try and answer these questions, are not unrelated to the challenges of policy. I think government measures what it cares about. And so what I'm seeing in some of these trends and some of the gaps in policy is an absence of data and information on some of the key elements, because they're not central to policy. So I think those things go together, which really speaks to the role of a foundation in thinking about its research agenda. And what I'd emphasize in relation then to these questions, so does family structure matter for children's well-being and outcomes? Well, we can look at the data and we can see, as Carey has said, that on average, in regression models, we find that for most outcomes, much of the difference in average outcomes of groups split into categories based on notions of family structure is explained by issues of income. But I don't think that means family structure doesn't matter. I think the issue is, how does family structure matter? And how do we think about the way in which families operate and ensure that policy and supports and practice are able to support family structures, which may be diverse. And I thought there was an interesting footnote in the paper about the use of the term lone parent, speaking as someone who's been an element of a family that would be categorized in that way, but was very involved in the parenting of my son. And these notions of structure, and Anne made this point, the family is not equal to the household. And we are very, very poor at understanding structures of network, of kin and relationship, wider notions of family and community, which are tremendously important in the lives of children, as both all speakers have mentioned. But we don't have very much data on at all. We, as I say, we tend to measure what we care about. For the benefit system and for the tax system, we need to know about income, and we need to know about the household. We're very challenged, really. And particularly for the most vulnerable families, who will be experience very changeable structures when we think about elements of risk and vulnerability of children to, whether it's to poverty or to harm. Those structures will change very rapidly. Adults will come in and out of households. I've been doing work in Blackpool, trying to understand the needs and the issues of children in receipt of the Better Start early years program in Blackpool, where huge proportions of the population that we can't even really quantify, but more than a third, are experiencing changing structures within a year as adults come in and out. And they're not on the radar of services. And that's not coincidence. Very often they are on the run from services or from each other or from care systems or from the police. Many of many of the most deprived households are experiencing huge change, and that's not captured in admin data sets or longitudinal data sets, which often neglect these children. They're not in scope. That was very explicit in the Millennium Cohort. It's very explicit in Understanding Society. Fragile, mobile, homeless, trafficked, many examples of children who are just left out of these data sets and whose families and the instability in those families is not adequately measured. So yes, family structure matters. It matters a lot, but we need to understand it. We need to understand it dynamically, and we need to have policy and practice mechanisms which can respond to it. And I think that raises big challenges both for policy and for social science. I'll make a similar point in relation to the implications of changing patterns of work and care, which again, the report brings out very well. And again, this point has been made, but I want to emphasize the importance of childcare and indeed wider activities for children and young people being both flexible and available, but also of high quality. And again, our policy system emphasizes what government cares about. And we see this in the pandemic. The response to schools and early year settings is they've got to be there because parents have to work, not because they are good environments for children. And I don't mean to make that so binary. Of course, government cares about the well-being of children and wants settings to be good places for children. But if you look at what we measure the number of hours. And we have very poor data on the quality of settings. I think upwards of 90% of early year settings are considered to be outstanding. And yet many children come out of these settings without good learning. And we don't have good ways in real data of measuring the quality of provision in a lot of those settings. And so I think this notion of quality is really important and relates also to the issue of family structure. That as Gordon Harold's work and the EIF work and DWP work on this issue is highlighting, yes, family structure matters, but if we want to support children in families working with the structures that are there, we have to understand the quality of the relationship between adults, whether in an intact couple or not, and perhaps particularly not. We have to understand the quality of the dynamics between adults, as well as the easier thing to measure, which is the structure. So again, it comes back to how we measure these more difficult things of relationship, of context, of quality of interaction, which are not so amenable to administrative data sets and so easy to capture in surveys. I think these raise big challenges, but I think these issues reflect, I think, where the field has got to, partly as a result of all the work that we're seeing reviewed today. On the third question, is inequality the most significant factor? I think Anne's made the critical point that here we need to think about inequalities. And yes, inequalities matter. And again, I think there is a change in public policy and public mood away from thinking about simple binary categories of inequality, poor, not poor, to recognizing the diversity and the complexity of these notions and issues of intersectionality. And mentioned Black Lives Matter. There are multiple forms of inequality. And again, our data and our social science, I'm not sure has entirely kept up with that social trend. So I think, again, a theme for future research. And I will just close on the question of where are we on policy, returning to where I started, which is I think it's glib to observe that we're in a major crisis. But in relation to children, it is extremely concerning, both to see the impact of 10 years austerity and what that has done to the capacity of society to protect the most vulnerable children, or even identify them at this point in the pandemic, where we've lost so many of our data sources. we know very little about what's really happening now in relation to poverty and vulnerability to harm. Facing, again, continued austerity, these are major challenges. And that would be true for any government facing this situation. But it does worry me greatly, the weakness of policy thinking now in relation to children. What I'm seeing in spending reviews is a focus on infrastructure investment, buildings, and other forms of capital investment. And one wonders, where are people within all of this? And underneath all that, where are children? It won't be the only point in history in which children have been neglected and ignored. But I hope in the discussion that we will now have, people will find reasons for optimism, because I don't want to leave things on a pessimistic note. But I do think we have to raise that challenge. Where are children in our policy debate today? Thank you.
Liam, thank you very much. And there's some questions there that you've raised that I'd like us to come back to. That point about not just the complexity of the data, but the people who are invisible in it. Another point you might think about, which has been raised in the question and answers, is what we can learn from the data of other countries and international comparisons. So if you could hold that as something I'll try to come back to. We're going to move to the particularities of the challenges of practice. And I think it picks up on a point that's been raised by two of our respondents in the Q&A, which is about avoidance of conflict. We heard earlier on the point about the need for stability and security, which was made by Philippa Stroud. And 2 points in the chat and the Q&A have talked about, do we put enough emphasis on separating well and enabling couples to separate well? And I think that's a good cue to bring in Patrick Myers from the Department for Work and Pensions, who's Senior Ambassador for Reducing Parental Conflict and the programme for doing that, and the extent to which that is an area which has been under thought through. So I think somewhere on my screen I can see Patrick, there he is. Patrick, can I turn to you for your reflections?
Of course, and thank you very much for the invitation to share some of my thoughts on the paper that's been launched today. Like everyone else, I'm really excited about this paper because I think it has an opportunity to, well, not the opportunity, it actually adds insight into current issues facing those who create early years policy and those who work at the practice level. The discussion that I've had with Carey is very much along how do you convert policy into a bit of a movement that changes practice. And I think we've got an opportunity here in order to make that really happen. And in the world where I locate that is, of course, looking at it through the lens of parental conflict. And thank you, Leon, for the slight introduction to this as I move through very quickly a very brief talk. It deals with the impact of parental conflict in the early years as creating environments that may impair child development. It recognizes it's not necessarily family structure that is the only variable, but more importantly, or as importantly, I can't make up my mind what I want to say around that, but it's the quality of the interparental relationship that matters, whether families are intact or whether they're separating or whether they're separated. For example, the reason why I think it's really important in the early years, we know that newborn infants are reactive to stress and actually may have been reacting to stress for some time through the impact of mother's neurohormones and the impact that that has on the unborn child. So we know sometimes that children actually enter this world with all of their stress reactivity already neurally set. And we know the role that cortisol plays in this process, and we also know that the transition to parenthood, many parents experience an increase in relationship stress and strain. put that into the COVID mix, and I think we can see what might happen, and we've alluded to it, and Carey has given us some insight about what that happens. The program I work on is seeking to help frontline practitioners to be curious around the issue of interparental conflict so that we can support and work with parents, helping them understand the impact of their conflict on their children. When I was back in Dorset, we did some work around speech and language, and we came to the awareness that growing up in a conflicted household often means infants only hear language as loud noise and directive. Without exposure to expressive language, children may not be ready for school or nursery, and we know that there are other developmental outcomes associated with growing up in homes where there is parental conflict. Gordon Harold, in his document, stated that babies as young as 6 months demonstrate physical reactions to loud arguing. So I'm going to conclude with not my words. It's an easy way to actually do a presentation, is use someone else's words. But in conclusion, I want to use the words of Dr. Camilla Rosen and Ellen Grimace, who have very usefully considered best practice in this area. And they state, relationship difficulties can leave an enduring adverse legacy for new parents and their growing families. Problems in the couple relationship are significant risk factors in the perinatal period, a period that we're interested in here, and as such is significantly under-recognized as a health issue because we know that they can lead to physical and mental health issues, poor parenting practice, and adverse development outcomes for children. Community practitioners, this is bringing it back to where we need to be influencing practice, are in a unique position to engage couples in their practice and prevent relationship difficulties from arising and enduring, and in turn pave the way for infants to be nurtured and to thrive. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much. I would just like to pick up on actually the point that you alluded to there, which has been a thread in our commentary, which is, to what extent do we have the systems and the right approach to trying to ensure separation without conflict? And if we were to emphasize that more, do you think we would see positive results come through?
Yes. I've been on the private law working group, which is called the subgroup called Family Solutions, and the recommendations there that we need to have much more in place, pathways that avoid the necessity for going to court and dealing with differences in that way. There is, if you like, a groundswell, I believe now, of the judiciary, Ministry of Justice, who were on a webinar this morning with me about thinking about alternatives to court. It's not a very good example to your children if you're battling out some minor differences. Judge Wildblood from Bristol in the Times a couple of weeks ago suggested, well, not a suggestion, he provided an example of where parents had come to court to organise which junction of the M4, sorry, which service station of the M4 they were going to exchange the child for care. That's inappropriate to be coming to court. There's a lot of work to do in this space. And I think the connection between the work you're doing here in early years and the Justice Observatory, there's a big overlap that could help actually improve those lives of those children for separating and separated parents.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been noticeable, hasn't it, in this discussion, how it has been about the complexities of the relationship with families and their wider context. And refreshingly, in many ways, we have not been talking about mothers and children specifically. Our next speaker, Adrian Burgess, is the Joint Chief Executive and Head of Research at the Fatherhood Institute. And Adrian, I wonder how you would reflect on the conversation so far.
Oh, good afternoon. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much, Tim. And it's been fascinating so far. So I'll now try to contribute a little bit. I've got 3 minutes, I think, so I won't overrun. So first of all, the report's fantastic, and it's wonderful to see it pulled together. And from my point of view, to see the word father used throughout is in itself a huge thing. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of reports that I read which talk about parents and don't disaggregate by the sex of the parent. Often when you look into it, they don't describe their sample. Sometimes they do, and they'll say we had many more mothers, so we decided not to include fathers, but they still talk about parents all the way through, and it masks the fact that they're really looking at mothers. So I also spend quite a lot of my time in practice. The Fatherhood Institute has been going for 20 years. We've kept right off separation because we didn't ever want to be thought of as a separated dads organization, which we aren't. We are just for the study of fatherhood from, pregnancy, pre-pregnancy, right through the life cycle. And one of the things I find, I've just spent weeks writing a response to the NICE postnatal care guideline, which is up for updating. They had a guideline in 2006. And it's amazing, they will not use the word father in it. Father is not used in the new revised midwife competencies. It's extraordinary. They just will occasionally talk about parent or parents. And then when you look at the actual document, sometimes by parents, they mean more mothers, plural of mothers. And sometimes they do mean fathers and mothers. So it's extraordinary that, they're just kind of missing. As Leon said, government measures what it cares about. And I think there are real worries about seeming to care about fathers, as if it's a zero-sum game, and even thinking about them will take away from mothers. So the father's name isn't on the mother's hospital record. It's not on the child's health record, including the Red Book. There are huge issues for safeguarding, of course, if no one knows who the father is. Officially, though everybody does know, and also huge issues for health research. Now, Paul Ramchandani and others have discovered that poor mental health in expectant fathers has negative impact on children, particularly boys, right through primary school. And that's when controlling for a range of factors, including the father's continuing mental health. So there you have it, this man who's depressed is what they've measured, depression, not anxiety. If the father's depressed in the antenatal period, it has this huge impact. And you think, well, that's amazing because he hasn't even met the baby. But of course, what you have is when the father has poor mental health, there may be stress going from the mother across the placenta, but also that he may not work. There may be financial implications. So the fathers have this huge impact. The other thing I really want to make clear, and this is always a surprise to people, that fathers are there. At the time of the birth, there are hardly any single mothers. 95% of couples jointly register the births in all the countries of the UK. 95% of fathers, according to Camilla Rosen, who was saying to me the latest NHS figures, say that 95% of fathers are at the birth. 95% of couples are either married or cohabiting or declare that they are a couple. They're living separately at the moment, maybe we'll be moving in together, or we're good friends. So what you've got is just 5% where the mother will tell you we're not in a relationship. But then if you actually track them, you find they're very often in regular contact with between the child and the father, and the mother and the father. So fathers are there in this huge, to this huge degree, and yet they are missing. I'll be interested to see what the report on childcare for children shows, because everyone talks about it as though it's formal, or as though there's formal care and then there's informal care, but they talk about it as non-parental. And what we don't see is what the father is doing separately from the mother. So in fact, fathers give about as much care of children as grandparents do, but that's never said. And also, there is research that shows that when mothers work, if the father's highly involved, it doesn't have to be a stay-at-home dad, but if you've got a highly involved hands-on dad, of course this affects outcomes for children, which are often very positive. So I don't think I can go on for much longer. I just want to say that Nuffield has been brilliant and has helped us develop a wonderful online EndNote library of research from 1998 to now on fathers, which we hope to be able to offer next year for people to pay us to run searches for them, which I think would be very illuminating. We have 3,472 records, 3,472 in the EndNote library that is just UK research. So it's UK research, it's also policy papers and things, but everything directly relevant to fathers. And of those, 819 cover the postnatal period through preschool. So actually the research is far greater than one thinks.
Adrian, thank you very much. I must move us on, but that was very valuable insights. I'm going to move now, if I may, to our Professor Susan Harkness from Bristol, who's Professor of Public Policy and the Director there of the Centre for Poverty and Social Justice, whose research focuses on gender and family structures, relationships to inequality and poverty. So there seems to be one of the themes that's coming through from this seminar is the problem of being able to identify what data and indeed conceptual approaches we need to measure the to get the measure of the right questions we need to ask. And I'm interested for your thinking on how we take forward the research agenda here to answer some of the points that have been raised.
Okay. Thank you very much and for the review, and in fact all the speakers have raised so many interesting points. I just wanted to say three things, and actually these highlight more gaps, so probably don't address your question, Tim. I'm going to talk about things that I think we can look at rather than things that I know we don't have the data for, so I don't want to address the data gaps, which although incredibly important, I haven't got a solution for. So the first thing I wanted to just mention was the sort of discussion. I want to emphasize the focus on family structure and inequality. And I just wanted to mention three things. So the first is in relation to the change in cohabitation. And to me, this sort of raises a puzzle, because if we look at changes in cohabitation, rates over time, one thing we know is that women with degrees get married when they have children, and that hasn't changed over time. So to me, one of the really sort of curious questions about that is, why are women who are middle educated in particular, but also who are lower educated, who have always been more likely to cohabit, not marrying? And in particular, it makes me think about what are the barriers to marriage, and should we be thinking more, sort of turning the question on its head a little bit more and thinking about what are the roles of inequalities, in particular in access to housing, but also insecure labour markets, in driving these or enabling people to have the family lives they might otherwise choose to have. Because it seems this sort of collapse in marriage amongst middle educated women seems incredibly important. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention was this, the point about single mothers. And I think it's already been, I mean, of course, in the review, it's made clear that single parenthood, or single motherhood, I should say, is not associated with changes in parenting, but it is associated with economic advantage. And I think that's very clear. And we know that the economic disadvantage associated with single parenthood or single motherhood in particular is related to worse child outcomes. Now, I know that, for example, policies, if we think about what can we do about it, I think policies to encourage marriage, I think have largely not been very successful. So, you know, whilst that may be some people's desirable outcome, how realistic is it? What are the policy proposals that can actually enable that to happen? And I wanted to put together a different, well, to suggest a different angle on this, which is to think about motherhood and motherhood pay penalties. So one thing we do know is that single fathers, if we look across countries, are not systematically more likely to be living in poverty, whereas single mothers across countries have a much greater poverty risk. And if we think about why this is, it's really because of these motherhood and gender penalties to parenthood. So fathers don't face those same pay and employment penalties as mothers do. And if we could just do something about that, I think it would do an awful lot to reduce poverty. We know that if women could just maintain their earnings at the same level as before they had children, we would see poverty fall by the same amount as if their partner hadn't left. So I think these are really kind of areas around the labour market that we really need to think about if we think there's a connection between family structure and inequality. And then the final thing that I wanted to mention, I think is really under-researched, which Carey has indeed pointed out, which is this idea about changing family forms. But we know there are as many step-parent or blended families as there are lone parent families, but we virtually never talk about them. And yet I think there's very good evidence from America, for example, that repartnering doesn't improve children's outcomes. It may improve their economic circumstances, but the evidence on what it does for child outcomes seems to suggest it probably doesn't have an enormous effect. And Leon also mentioned the point about sort of these multiple family transitions, which we see really commonly in the US, but I think are less frequent, even if they are frequent in some areas in the UK, certainly in our data, which may be a data weakness. But one thing I wanted to mention here in terms of policy is what the unintended consequences of some of the current decisions we're making in terms of policy are. And in particular, we know in the US that where welfare benefits for single mothers have been cut, they repartner much more quickly. And it seems to me that, for example, if we're to enter a new range of austerity, if universal credit increases are not likely to be extended, we may have these unintended consequences where we get rapid changes in family forms, more co-residence of single parent families with other families that may have very negative outcomes for children. And I think that's something we also need to think about, the wider benefits of our welfare system. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Susan, thank you for getting a huge amount in a short time, and particularly some very particular challenges, I think, to our research agenda, particularly that point you made about labour markets. There are a lot of points I hope we'll have time to come back to, but we have one more speaker, Christine Farquharson, who is a senior research economist at the IFS. And I think, Christine, your research that I think we funded on the impact of lockdown on children reception years relates to what has been our underlying theme of our discussion today, which is the intensification of the pandemic on a lot of the themes and problems that we've been identifying. And I'd be interested for your thinking on essentially where we're starting from now as we look to the fairly economically grim outcomes that we have as a result of this past 9 months, and how we will adapt our policies and thinking to this agenda in the light of that.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for having me here. Especially thank you to Carey and to Jordan for a really excellent report. I think there's a lot that we can all take from that. As Tim said, we at IFS have been undertaking a study looking at the impact that COVID has had on school-aged children, so not quite the early years, which is the focus of this report, but looking both at the impacts on children and the impacts on their parents. And I think Tim put this really well, which is that what we're finding is there's a lot to do with the inequalities, both between men and women and between poorer and richer children, but that in many ways COVID has not created new inequalities, but has really intensified what was already there. From the perspective of children, we can see that in their learning time. So before the lockdown, primary school age children, basically whatever their family income, were all spending about 6 hours a day doing learning-based activities, mainly at school, but also a little bit at home. During the lockdown, everybody got worse, but children in the richest fifth of families, that went down to about 5 hours and 15 minutes. They lost about 45 minutes of learning time a day. For children in the poorest fifth of families, that went down to about 4 hours. And so that was a case where you saw something that was fairly equal, and now we see a really large gap newly emerging during the lockdown in particular. And what makes that more worrying is that these poorer children from more disadvantaged families really faced a triple whammy. Not only were they spending less time on learning, they were also getting far fewer resources from their schools in terms of online classes or engagement with teachers, the kinds of active learning resources that we think might be particularly useful for making that home learning period productive. And on top of that, they had far fewer resources available at home. Part of that was the digital divide that we've heard a little bit about today, but part of it was really basic things like just not having a quiet study space in the home or anywhere with a table where they could actually do their schoolwork. I think, though, one of the lessons that comes out of our research is that these issues are not simple to study and they're not simple to understand. So we also looked at the extent to which that lack of school resources and that lack of home resources explained what was the bigger drops in learning time for the poorest children. And we found that at primary school, it only explained about 1/3 of that gap, which means that there are a whole host of other factors, from parental confidence in supporting with home learning to the kind of time patterns and the work patterns that parents had available, to peer effects. There's a whole bunch of other things which are going on and affecting those decisions, which aren't easily explained and which aren't necessarily easily fixed by policy. Looking at inequalities between mothers and fathers, again, it's a sort of mixed picture. So we knew going into the crisis that actually mothers and fathers were doing quite a lot less childcare than mothers. But they've in fact doubled the amount of time that they were spending with their children during the lockdown. Mothers have taken on quite a lot more. They've gone from about 6.5 hours to 10.5 hours. But actually, because fathers were starting from a lower base, the total amount of childcare time has equalized between men and women. Not all the way, but that gap has grown smaller than what it was before. And so the big question going forward is going to be how much of that is maintained, particularly by the time that we ran the second wave of our survey. We were seeing far more fathers going back into work and in particular working outside of the home. So the question will be whether this is a longer term shift in norms or whether it was a shorter term reaction to the realities that COVID threw up. But I think, again, it's important to have a note of caution in the findings that we have there, because quite often we hear that the solution to these things is to offer more flexibility. And if we can have flexible working, then mothers and fathers will be able to take on more childcare. And what we found, admittedly in quite a weird context, is it doesn't necessarily seem to have worked out that way. Mothers were much more likely to lose their job, much more likely to cut back on their hours of work. But even during the times when they were doing paid work for their employer, they were far more likely, 50% more likely than fathers, to be interrupted by childcare needs. And so flexibility, it will certainly help some kinds of families, but if flexibility just means trying to do two things at the same time that don't necessarily fit together, you could just end up having the worst of all worlds. And finally, I wanted to end quite quickly on a completely different note, but really picking up on some of what Jordan was saying about the bigger picture role of public policy in all of this. I think the question was, is family policy still a key priority of the government? On the kind of macro spending figures, it seems like clearly it is. When we look at the total amount of support from early years, it has gone up from about 2 billion in the early 2000s to about 6 billion in the last couple of years. But I think that's masking a really interesting change within that, which is that again and again and again, we've seen the free entitlement and free childcare prioritized with more hours, more children covered, extensions to those entitlements. And that's come really at the expense of support for childcare through the benefit system, targeting in particular low earning families, and at the expense of support for children's services such as Sure Start, which really aim to give an early intervention with a slightly more holistic focus than childcare. So really that shift in where policy is acting has two impacts. First, it's changing the flavor and the kinds of priorities that government says it has and the kinds of priorities that government is funding, moving more towards workers and more towards childcare as a way of helping parents to work. But also it's changing the age profile of children. So now we're seeing a lot of funding on 3- and 4-year-olds with the extended 3- and 4-year-old entitlement, whereas the programs that are universal or apply to all age groups in the preschool period through the benefit system, through the tax credit, tax-free childcare system, and especially through programs like Sure Start, those programs for the 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds have really been cut back. And so we are seeing a shift in, not a shift in the amount of emphasis being put on the early years, but quite large shifts in how those policies are being delivered within that.
Christine, thank you. Thank you very much for opinioning that particular policy point and that shift. I also noticed Susan nodding when you were talking about the motherhood penalties of flexible working, absolutely echoing what she said. We have only a little time left, and many points which I'd like to pick up, but I don't think we've got time, but maybe we can afterwards. Particularly I'd like to hear Philippa on a question that was asked about family learning classes, actually, and to what extent one of our audience said how important are those, and good to get back afterwards to them. Also, Leon, that point about international comparators, and actually, and if you had a moment, do you have any reflections on what we can learn from international comparative data?
That's such a huge question. I'm conscious that one tends to talk about the Nordic countries, particularly in relation to their uses of admin data and making them available. But I think these issues apply universally. I mean, there are so many questions in play. It's hard to say exactly what the issue is. But for me, if the issue is understanding children's lives in a broader context that thinks about the relationships around them, their networks, their well-being, and their development in holistic terms, that's a problem everywhere.
Thanks very much. And given we only have a couple of minutes left, I'm going to give the conclusion back to Carey, whose report this was, the first of 7. And Carey, there have been a whole series of prompts here for the Foundation as a whole, particularly for you, on where to take this research agenda forward. And a lot that we've had here today, I'm sure, will be incorporated in the work we're going to go on to do. I wonder if there are any particular points you wanted to draw out from our many contributors, so we can make sure we end with those.
Thank you. I mean, what an incredibly rich discussion and set of contributions. It's impossible to sort of draw them together and to do justice to them. But the things that I think is striking, I think is the issue of complexity, the relationship, the difference between family and household, that a number of people have talked about either directly or indirectly, and therefore being able to really understand how family form and the other things that come into kind of play really shape children's lives. And it struck me that while there's a big data problem in terms of not being able to capture many things, there's also something about a research methods kind of question, which is in order to understand those processes, how people think about those, the meanings they attach to certain behaviours, we need to think actually about a range of research methods that we wouldn't capture that. And also what's going on within families, that actually, you know, we know quite a lot about the bigger picture, but we know less about the sort of dynamics inside families. I was struck by your question, Philippa, about, you know, what enables stability, and I think there were quite a lot of things that people mentioned, different sorts of policy ideas about what might enable stability. I was really struck by Adrian's point about the fact that so many both parents attend the birth. I knew about joint registration, attend the birth. What's sort of going on? How could we keep people more involved, fathers more involved? Why is it? Or do we just don't know, actually? Do we not really know the reality of the involvement? Obviously, so I think that's the biggest thing that I would take away. There are lots and lots of other points that are very important. I think for us, you know, we can draw on what people have said to really think hard about either other research questions or trying to think more in depth about particular issues. So, and I think also, Anne, your point about ethnicity and race, and really thinking about, you know, what do we know now in relation to early years in childcare, and you know, what are the gaps, and how do we really take that on board in terms of trying to understand young children's experiences across different ethnic groups, and have a much richer understanding of that if we're going to actually be able to respond again in policy and practice terms.
Well, everyone, thank you very much indeed. Our large audience that has been only able to join and listened, but many thanks for those of you who put questions to us, and we've answered as many as we can. I'd like to thank our speakers and all their different responses. We will trawl this seminar because in it there is a wealth of material for us to take forward and come back to you on. There's an entire research agenda that is emerging here. I hope you'll join us for the future chapters of this project as they roll out in the course of next year. and very much at the end when we try and pull this together into some conclusions based on the vast amount of research that Nuffield has funded over the years, and whereby making these connections and with your connections too, we can, I hope, produce an agenda, a manifesto for future research, which can be of use to those in policy and those in practice. But for now, thank you all very much indeed for joining us, all our speakers and all those who've been attending, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks very much indeed.